Hey guys, tonight we drift far north, where the air tastes like salt and frost, and where the winds carry voices that echo across lava fields and fjords. You stand on a windswept plain, the ground hard with moss and stone, and before you rises a great basalt outcropping, the Law Rock, or Logberg. Here, in medieval Iceland, law is not locked in books, but spoken aloud into the cold air, every word carried by the wind and memorized by those gathered. The chill nips at your ears, and the crowd pulls their cloaks tighter, listening as justice itself is recited. You probably wouldn't survive long here, given your lack of sealskin boots and your total inability to milk a goat in a blizzard. But that's what imagination is for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing this little map of the world light up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Althing, Iceland's great assembly, is in session. You trudge closer across the uneven earth, weaving past tents and cooking fires where families have camped for the annual gathering. Traders shout about smoked fish and imported cloth, children chase each other with sticks, and farmers argue about sheep that wandered too far into someone else's pasture. But at the center, on the rock, the law speaker stands, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. Mainstream fact: the Althing was founded around 930 CE and is often considered the world's oldest continuous parliament. No king presided here. Laws were declared aloud, and disputes settled by chieftains and assemblies of free men. Historians still argue whether the system was truly democratic or more of an oligarchy controlled by a handful of powerful families. You push closer to hear the booming voice. The law speaker is robed in wool dyed a faded saffron, his beard flecked with gray. He speaks from memory, reciting rules about land rights, grazing, debts, and punishments. It's impressive and just a little terrifying. Imagine being the one guy who has to keep the entire law code memorized. Forget a section, and suddenly someone gets away with stealing your cow. The crowd reacts in ripples. A man nods solemnly when the rules of outlawry are spoken. A woman mutters darkly about cattle fines, elbowing her husband who looks guilty. A boy yawns dramatically, clearly unimpressed by the poetry of property law. At the edge of the crowd, gossip swirls. You hear whispers about last year's trial, when a man was forced to prove his innocence by plunging his arm into boiling water. You overhear laughter about a neighbor fined for insulting another's honor with what must have been a very creative nickname. Even here, where the law is sacred, people never stop adding their side commentary. Quirky tidbit: it was common at the Althing for disputes to spill into poetry. If someone insulted you in verse, you might retaliate with an even sharper rhyme. Insult poetry as a legal weapon. It's like rap battles, but with more sheep metaphors. You glance up at the Law Rock itself, dark and jagged against the sky. Legends say the rock amplifies the speaker's voice, carrying it across the plain. Whether that's natural acoustics or poetic exaggeration, the effect is undeniable. The words seem to hum in your bones. Nearby, a group of men in russet cloaks argue heatedly about whether their cousin owes them a horse or a cow. They're red-faced, their hands gesturing wildly. A passing priest sighs, reminding them to settle it before the courts rather than with axes. They grumble, but you notice their hands never leave the hilts of their knives. Still, the assembly is not only about conflict. Traders from distant fjords bring wares: walrus ivory, homespun wool, foreign trinkets from Norway. Children press close to see bright beads glint in the sunlight. A woman barters dried fish for cloth, dyed indigo, her laughter ringing clear as the deal is struck. The Althing is law and market, justice and festival, punishment and play, all tangled together. You sit on a low rock, watching it unfold. The law speaker's words rise and fall like waves washing over the crowd. Around you, fires crackle, smoke curls upward, and the smell of roasted lamb drifts through the air. It feels timeless, like the land itself is listening. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were mainly about lofty ideals of justice or about raw power plays among chieftains. As you watch a particularly smug noble slip a pouch of silver into another's hand, you suspect both things were true. By evening, the day's recitations end. The crowd disperses toward tents, voices still buzzing with arguments and laughter. The law rock looms dark against the twilight, silent now but heavy with memory. You realize you've witnessed something fragile yet enduring, a society without kings or castles, ruling itself by words spoken into the wind. You climb back into your borrowed bedroll, the northern sky glowing faintly with midnight sun. The voices of the Althing drift through your dreams, law and poetry mingling, as eternal as the basalt under your head. The next day dawns with a thin layer of frost glittering across the moss and stones. Your breath clouds in front of you as you walk along a narrow track that winds away from the bustle of the Althing. Today, you follow the fate of a man declared an outlaw. He stands at the edge of the crowd, his cloak pulled tightly around him, his face pale not from the cold, but from the knowledge that he is no longer part of this community. The law speaker's judgment has been final. His crime, perhaps theft, perhaps a feud gone wrong, has earned him the ultimate sentence, outlawry. Not a quick punishment, not a fine of cattle or silver, but exile from human society itself. You imagine how it feels to hear the verdict spoken aloud, the community turning its face away. You probably wouldn't survive even a week in this land without support. No Netflix, no grocery store, and the sheep here don't just volunteer to become dinner. Mainstream fact. Icelandic law in the Middle Ages included full outlawry, which meant anyone could kill the outlaw without penalty, and lesser outlawry, a 3-year exile in which the offender had to leave the island entirely. Historians still argue whether outlawry functioned more as a legal death sentence or as a practical way to push troublemakers out of a fragile, resource-scarce society. You trail behind the man as he walks into the wilderness. His figure grows smaller against the vastness of the land. Black lava fields stretching to the horizon, icy rivers snaking through valleys, mountains capped with snow even in summer. He carries little: a cloak, a knife, a bundle of dried fish. No friends walk beside him. By law, to shelter an outlaw is to share his punishment. He is alone. The land feels sharper, harsher once you see it through his eyes. The wind slices across your face. The rocks bite into your boots. The silence presses in. No smoke from farmsteads welcomes him. Instead, he trudges toward caves and hollows, places where only foxes and ravens dwell. You picture him making a bed of moss in the corner of a cave, listening to the drip of melting ice, clutching his knife, and wondering whether dawn will come. Quirky tidbit. Sagas tell of outlaws living in remote ravines or even high in lava formations, stealing sheep at night to survive. Some became legendary, half criminal, half folk hero, like Grettir the Strong, who wrestled trolls in his spare time while hiding from the law. Of course, you don't need to fight a troll to know living without human contact is punishment enough. You pause by a river, watching its icy surface rush toward the sea. The outlaw kneels to drink, his hands trembling. The cold water numbs your tongue, but it tastes sharper, clearer, as if the land itself is both feeding and testing you. You feel the hunger gnawing already. Dried fish and bitter herbs only last so long. In the distance, you see smoke, farmers tending their homes. The outlaw watches too, but he does not approach. He knows the law. If he steps too close, anyone may kill him. He turns instead toward the hills, shoulders slumping, a figure erased from his own people. At night, the temperature plummets. You huddle in the dark, hearing wolves howl across the valley. The outlaw presses his back to a rock wall, knife in hand, eyes darting. He cannot light a fire. Its glow would betray him. The cold seeps into your bones, and you realize survival here isn't measured in weeks or months, but in each aching heartbeat. Historians still argue whether outlawry was intended as a chance at redemption or simply a slow-motion execution. Some men did return after lesser outlawry, scarred but alive, reclaiming land and family. Others vanished into legend, swallowed by ice and stone. The sagas rarely give you neat endings, just echoes of men trudging into the wilderness, names fading with each step. By dawn, frost covers your cloak. You rise stiffly, following the outlaw one last time. He stops at a ridge, looking back toward the valleys he once called home. The mountains loom behind him, the sea glitters faintly in the distance, and the wind whistles through the rocks. He turns away without a word, vanishing into the wild. You stand there long after he's gone, the emptiness stretching in every direction. The punishment is clear. Not the pain of chains or the humiliation of stocks, but the slow, relentless silence of a land that does not forgive loneliness. The frost still lingers on the moss when you return to the assembly plane, but the mood is different today. A small crowd has gathered near a turf-roofed hall, their faces tense, their breath steaming in the morning chill. Word spreads quickly. Someone is to undergo a trial by ordeal. You edge closer, curiosity prickling despite the cold. A heavy cauldron sits in the center, suspended above a fire, its iron sides hissing as water boils within. The smell of smoke, damp wool, and nervous sweat mixes in the air. A priest in a russet cloak stirs the water with an iron rod, chanting quietly in Latin, while a group of farmers shift uneasily, their hands buried deep in their sleeves. Mainstream fact: trial by ordeal was a common form of justice in medieval Europe, and Iceland was no exception. The accused might plunge a hand into boiling water or carry a piece of hot iron. If the wound healed cleanly, God had declared them innocent. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were truly meant as divine tests, or whether communities quietly manipulated outcomes to fit the verdicts they already wanted. You watch the accused step forward, a young man accused of theft, his jaw tight with fear. His mother grips his sleeve for a moment, then lets go. The priest raises his hand for silence. A hush falls over the crowd, broken only by the bubbling water. The moment stretches unbearably. The young man plunges his arm into the cauldron, the hiss of flesh meeting boiling water making the crowd flinch. He pulls it out, dripping, his face pale but defiant. The priest wraps the hand in linen while murmuring prayers. In 3 days, they will check the wound. If it festers, he is guilty. If it heals, he is free. You glance at the boy's face and see the weight of 3 days heavier than any chain. Quirky tidbit: some sagas hint that clever folk cooled the cauldron slightly before ordeals, or wrapped their arms in protective ointments made of herbs, fat, or even fish slime. You can almost imagine some farmer's wife muttering, "Don't worry, dear. This cod liver salve will fool God himself." The villagers murmur among themselves as the ritual concludes. Some cross themselves, others nod grimly. You overhear one man mutter that God's judgment is rarely as mysterious as people pretend, especially if the priest owes you a favor. A woman snaps back that doubting the ordeal is doubting God, and the tension simmers like the cauldron itself. Later, you find yourself standing near the accused's tent. His friends sit in silence, staring into the fire as if willing his hand to heal. The boy himself cradles his bandaged arm, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. You feel the weight of the waiting, the gnawing uncertainty of 3 endless days in a land where winters stretch long and food is scarce. Justice here isn't swift. It lingers, gnaws, unsettles. The ordeal has another effect. It binds the community together in judgment. For 3 days, everyone gossips, debates, and speculates. At the marketplace, a fisherman swears the boy's guilt is written on his face. A shepherd shakes his head, insisting he's innocent and that the ordeal is a cruel sham. The truth gets lost somewhere between the smoke of the cooking fires and the whispers of the crowd. On the third day, you return with the villagers. The priest unwraps the linen, holding the boy's hand high for all to see. The crowd surges forward, craning their necks. The wound looks raw, red around the edges. Gasps ripple through the people. The priest announces that God has spoken. Guilty. The boy's shoulders slump as though the verdict had been carved into his bones. His mother sobs, and a neighbor shakes his head sadly, though not all are convinced. Historians still argue whether these outcomes reflected real belief in divine judgment or whether they served as a convenient way to reinforce social consensus. To you, watching the young man escorted away to face his punishment, the line between faith and politics seems thin indeed. The cauldron is left to cool, its steam drifting into the air. The crowd disperses slowly, voices buzzing with excitement and unease. For some, the ordeal has affirmed justice. For others, it has only deepened doubt. You step away from the hall, the smell of boiled iron clinging to your cloak, and realize that in Iceland's harsh world, guilt and innocence often mattered less than whether the community agreed to believe in them. As evening falls, you walk along the river, the wind sharp against your cheeks. Somewhere a raven caws, its harsh cry echoing over the rocks. The ordeal may be finished, but the unease lingers, like a wound that refuses to heal. The plain is noisy again, but this time the voices don't belong to priests or law speakers. Instead, you hear the rough laughter of men haggling, the clipped tones of women arguing over livestock, and the sharper cries of insult when negotiations falter. You find yourself at the center of one of the most complicated aspects of Icelandic justice: feuds and blood prices. Two families stand facing each other, the gap between them as wide as a battlefield. One man clutches his cloak around him, his knuckles white. Across from him, another leans on a staff, his eyes cold. The cause of the feud? A killing perhaps sparked by a grazing dispute or a careless insult. Now the matter isn't settled with a duel, not yet, but with silver, cattle, and words that weigh as heavily as weapons. Mainstream fact: in medieval Iceland, the legal system often resolved killings through wergild, or blood money, a fine paid by the offender's family to the victim's kin. This system aimed to prevent endless cycles of revenge. Historians still argue whether blood prices truly calmed feuds or merely postponed the next round of violence. You shuffle closer as a mediator. A gray-bearded chieftain raises his voice. He proposes a payment: so many ounces of silver, plus a few cattle. Immediately, the victim's family erupts in protest. One woman spits on the ground, declaring her brother's life worth far more than 2 skinny cows and a handful of coins. The offender's kin bristle, muttering that the man wasn't worth much anyway. Tension sparks, and hands twitch toward knife hilts. The chieftain sighs deeply, as though he spent a lifetime babysitting angry farmers. He adjusts the terms. More cattle, a finer cloak thrown in, perhaps even some land transferred. Slowly, grudgingly, voices lower. It's like watching a pot about to boil over, then simmer back into uneasy calm. Quirky tidbit: sagas sometimes mention outrageous compensations, like a man demanding payment for the emotional trauma of being insulted in verse. Imagine turning a rap battle into a lawsuit and walking away with a sheep as damages. The negotiations stretch on for hours. You sit on a low rock, your cloak wrapped tight against the wind, listening as the arguments circle. The victim's mother insists her son's name must be sung at the next gathering to keep his honor alive. The offender's cousin groans that this is unnecessary, muttering under his breath that the boy's poetry wasn't that good anyway. At last, an agreement is struck. Silver coins gleam in the weak sunlight as they change hands, clinking softly. A pair of cattle is led forward, their breath steaming in the cold air. The families nod stiffly. though their eyes still burn with anger. Peace, for now, has been purchased, but it feels fragile, like ice thin enough to crack beneath your feet. As the crowd disperses, you overhear mutters. Some say the payment is fair, others whisper that revenge will still come. Historians still argue whether this system truly prevented bloodshed or simply turned murder into an expensive luxury item. Watching the tense faces of the two families, you suspect both are true. That evening, around the campfires, the feud is retold in fragments. Some embellish the insult that sparked it. Apparently, it involved sheep and questionable hygiene. Others argue that the compensation was too low, while a few insist it was surprisingly generous. The feud shifts from a raw wound into a saga in the making, woven into the fabric of memory. You lie back under the stars, listening to the distant bleating of cattle now marked as payment for a life. The air is sharp, the ground unforgiving, and you realize how precarious peace is here. Always negotiated, always fragile, always one insult away from collapsing into violence again. The wind howls across the plain, carrying with it the uneasy murmur of grudges not yet buried. The next morning, the mood is less tense but no less uncomfortable. You trudge toward the edge of a settlement where wooden posts stand upright, their surfaces worn smooth by wind and by the grasp of countless hands. A crowd gathers here too, but this time not for negotiation or exile, for humiliation. Someone is about to spend the day in the stocks. A man shuffles forward, his tunic rumpled, his cheeks already flushed red from shame. He kneels as the constables fit his wrists and neck into the rough wooden frame. With a creak and a thud, the bar closes, locking him in place. His body is bent awkwardly, his face exposed to every curious glance. The crowd stirs, whispering, pointing. You can feel the weight of eyes on him. The punishment less about pain than about being seen. Mainstream fact. Icelandic justice, like much of medieval Europe, relied heavily on punishments of public shame, stocks, pillories, and scolding benches, because prisons didn't exist in the modern sense. Historians still argue whether such punishments actually deterred crime or merely entertained bored neighbors. The man shifts, trying to hide his face, but there's nowhere to turn. A child giggles and tosses a clump of snow at him. It smacks his tunic, scattering into his lap. His jaw tightens, but he says nothing. A group of women passing with wicker baskets of fish pause, whispering loudly enough for all to hear about men who can't keep their hands off what isn't theirs. Their words sting sharper than the cold. Quirky tidbit. Some sagas tell of punishments that involved sitting on the Nadstol, a special seat of shame, often used for those accused of cowardice or adultery. Imagine a medieval naughty chair, except the whole village shows up to watch. The man's breath fogs in front of him as the hours drag by. He sneezes, then groans when someone mocks him for catching a cold. As punishment's bonus feature, farmers walk past on their way to tend sheep, shaking their heads in disapproval. A group of boys dare each other to get close, tugging at his hair before running away squealing with laughter. Even dogs sniff and bark, adding to the indignity. By noon, the wind sharpens, slicing through cloaks and skirts. You stamp your feet to keep warm, but the man in the stocks has no such relief. His fingers grow numb, his cheeks redden, and a trickle of tears slips down. Though whether from cold or humiliation, you can't tell. The punishment works not because of the wood, but because of the eyes, neighbors, kin, strangers, all seeing him small. At one point, an old woman in a teal shawl approaches. She sets down her basket and presses a piece of bread into his hand. For the hunger, not the shame, she mutters before walking away. The kindness surprises you, a tiny spark of humanity amid the jeers. As the day wanes, the constables finally release him. His joints creak as he stumbles free, rubbing at his neck and wrists. No blood, no broken bones, but the damage is visible all the same. People will remember seeing him bent low in the stocks long after the bruises fade. You step away with the crowd, your breath misting as gossip swirls. Some chuckle at his discomfort, others shake their heads solemnly. Historians still argue whether these public humiliations bonded communities through shared justice or fractured them by deepening resentments. Judging by the man's glare as he shuffles away, you wouldn't bet on forgiveness. Night falls, and the stocks stand empty once more, wooden silhouettes against the snow. You walk past them, the cold biting your nose, and imagine the silence they hold until the next unlucky soul is locked in place. Punishment here is not hidden. It's carved into memory, left standing where everyone must see. Snow drifts lazily across the valley as you make your way toward a low, turf-roofed building. Its walls blend almost seamlessly into the hillside, like the earth itself decided to hunch up against the cold. A carved wooden cross stands at the door, weathered by wind and rain. You step inside, and the sudden warmth envelops you. Smoke, beeswax, and the faint sweetness of drying herbs. This is no law rock, no shouting market. This is the realm of clerical authority, where sin and penance are weighed with as much gravity as cattle fines. A priest in a dark indigo robe stands near the altar, his breath fogging faintly in the chill that even the hearth can't chase away. He reads aloud from a parchment, his voice steady, though the villagers gathered in rough wool tunics shift uneasily. Today's topic is not theft of sheep or feuds over land. It is the state of their souls, and the heavy ledger of sins the church claims to tally. Mainstream fact. After Iceland converted to Christianity around the year 1000, priests and bishops began to share legal authority with the chieftains. Confession, penance, and even excommunication were tools as powerful as outlawry or fines. Historians still argue whether this clerical power was welcomed as moral order or resented as foreign intrusion into local traditions. You slip onto a bench as the sermon winds on. The priest warns that those who fail to pay their tithes risk not only hunger for the poor, but hunger for their own souls. A farmer frowns, tugging at his cloak. You can almost hear him calculating how many dried fish and sheepskins a tithe might cost. At the back, a woman whispers to her neighbor that the priest himself has taken a suspiciously fat goose from her cousin's farm. Her neighbor snorts, covering her laugh with a cough. Even here, under the gaze of the cross, gossip flourishes like moss in the cracks of stone. Quirky tidbit. Some records mention priests assigning unusual penances, like crawling on knees around a churchyard, or fasting on nothing but dry bread and water for weeks. One saga even hints at a man being ordered to recite psalms while balancing on one leg, though whether that was real penance or a storyteller's joke is anyone's guess. The villagers approach one by one for confession. You watch as a man kneels, muttering about a quarrel with his brother. The priest nods solemnly and prescribes prayers. A young woman admits to using charms for healing, her eyes darting nervously. The priest hesitates, then assigns extra penance, clearly uncertain whether to call it devotion or witchcraft. The line is thin, shifting with the winds of doctrine. In a corner, a boy fidgets, clearly uninterested in sin or salvation. He carves small runes into a stick with his knife, ignoring his mother's glare. When the priest notices, he sighs and mutters something about the devil finding work for idle hands. The boy grins cheekily, the kind of grin that probably earns him a lifetime of confessions. As dusk settles, the service ends. Villagers shuffle out into the cold, pulling cloaks tight, their breath rising like smoke into the air. Some leave with relief, others with resentment, a few with curiosity about how many prayers equal the cost of stolen cheese. The priest lingers by the door, blessing each as they pass, though his eyes are sharp, tallying more than just sins. Historians still argue whether the church's role in Iceland was primarily spiritual guidance or political maneuvering. Standing in the smoky glow of the turf-roof church, you sense it was both, souls and silver. prayers and power, twined together like the ropes binding a boat against winter storms. When the door finally shuts, you remain a moment longer, savoring the fading warmth. The candles sputter, their golden light dwindling. Outside, the snow falls thicker, covering the footprints of the villagers, as if even their sins are quickly buried under Iceland's long, white silence. The snowstorm eases overnight, and by morning a pale sun glows weakly through the clouds. You trudge across a windswept field, following the chatter of voices that drift from a cluster of turf houses. The air smells of wood smoke and something sharper, herbs drying in bundles that hang by the doorways. Neighbors have gathered here, not for feast or market, but for quieter, more anxious talk. Whispers of witchcraft ripple through the village. You duck inside a low doorway, brushing frost from your cloak. The room is dim, lit by a small fire on the hearth. Around it, men and women sit in a circle, their faces tense. On the floor before them lies a collection of odd items: carved bones, sprigs of juniper, a little leather pouch filled with dried plants. A healer, a woman in a russet dress with streaks of gray in her hair, explains softly how these charms help with childbirth, headaches, or the fever that has been haunting cattle. Mainstream fact: in medieval Iceland, belief in magic and charms blended uneasily with Christianity. The sagas mention galdrar, spells sung or whispered, used for healing or protection. Historians still argue whether accusations of witchcraft were genuine fears or convenient ways to undermine rivals and settle old grudges. You sit quietly, listening as the villagers debate. One farmer insists the herbs are harmless, just old traditions from before the cross. Another mutters that they smell of the devil. A young man claims his sheep grew sick after his neighbor used a charm. His neighbor rolls his eyes, muttering that sheep die more often from poor fences than sorcery. The room simmers with suspicion, like stew left too long on the fire. Quirky tidbit: one Icelandic charm supposedly involved carving runes on a piece of cheese, then feeding it to the sick. You imagine someone nibbling their medicine, wondering if they should chew faster to make the spell work quicker. The healer kneels by the fire, tossing herbs into the flames. Sweet smoke rises, filling the room. She murmurs a chant, her voice low, steady, almost like a lullaby. For a moment, the tension eases. Even the doubters grow still, lulled by the rhythm. You feel warmth seep into your bones, the smell of juniper wrapping around you like a blanket. But the peace doesn't last. A priest bursts through the doorway, his cloak heavy with snow. His eyes scan the scene, narrowing at the sight of charms spread across the floor. He lifts his hand, declaring sternly that only prayer, not spells, will heal sickness. The villagers shuffle uncomfortably. Some bow their heads. Others glance at the healer with sympathy. The woman doesn't protest. She gathers the bones, herbs, and pouch, placing them carefully into her lap. Her face is unreadable, calm, resigned, perhaps amused at the priest's certainty. You sense she has seen many such confrontations and knows they rarely end in her favor. The meeting dissolves awkwardly. People slip out into the cold, muttering in low voices. Some shake their heads, agreeing with the priest. Others whisper their gratitude to the healer, pressing small gifts into her hand when no one looks. You notice one mother quietly tucking a sprig of juniper into her child's cloak before leaving. Faith in the old ways lingers, hidden beneath wool and silence. Outside, the air bites sharper than before. You watch the villagers scatter back to their farms, each carrying both doubt and belief. The healer walks slowly to her home, clutching her pouch. Children run behind her, begging for charms to keep nightmares away. She smiles faintly, handing them small knots of twine, saying they'll keep bad dreams from crossing the threshold. Historians still argue whether Iceland's suspicion of witchcraft was ever as fierce as on the European mainland. The sagas hint at accusations, But outright witch hunts were rare until later centuries, when imported fears and laws spread north. Here, for now, suspicion is quieter. More whispers than pyres, more gossip than gallows. You walk on as dusk settles, the snow crunching under your boots. Somewhere in the distance, a raven caws, its call harsh against the wind. The sky darkens, and you imagine the healer lighting her fire again, smoke curling into the night, carrying old words that still cling stubbornly to the cold air of Iceland. A biting wind pushes you across the frozen meadow toward another gathering. This time, it's not about murder or magic, but something stranger. Cases where punishment seems to spill into absurdity. You round a bend and find a group of farmers arguing loudly beside a pen of bleeding sheep. At the center stands a man in a teal cloak, his finger stabbing toward the animals as though one of them has personally insulted him. Mainstream fact: medieval Icelandic law codes include odd provisions for livestock and property disputes. Animals could be central to wealth and survival, so the law sometimes treated them almost like people. Historians still argue whether animals were ever truly tried for crimes here, or if stories of beastly punishments were more symbolic tales used to mock human failings. You lean in closer. The man in the teal cloak swears that his neighbor's ram butted down part of his fence, letting sheep stray into his hay. He demands not just payment, but a kind of justice for the beast itself. His neighbor rolls his eyes, insisting the ram is just doing what rams do. The mediator, clearly weary of livestock drama, proposes a compromise. The offending ram will be tethered for a season, and its owner must pay a fine in butter. The crowd chuckles, some nodding in approval, others muttering that a ram tethered in winter is punishment enough. One woman jokes that the sheep should be put in the stocks beside yesterday's thief. Laughter ripples. Imagining woolly heads poking through wooden boards is too good not to picture. Quirky tidbit: there are tales, half believed, half mocked, that a horse once faced trial for kicking its master fatally. Supposedly, the beast was led before a gathering, judged guilty, and slaughtered as punishment. Whether true or not, you can't help but picture the solemnity of a horse awaiting its verdict, ears flicking while humans argue about legal precedent. Beyond animals, you hear stories of peculiar fines. A man fined for throwing dung at his neighbor's door. Another who had to pay 3 measures of butter for insulting someone's poetry. You imagine the shame of explaining to your family, "Yes, we're out of butter because I mocked his rhymes about sheep." As the day unfolds, more cases are aired. One farmer demands payment because a neighbor's goat chewed his haystack. Another insists his cow was bewitched, producing sour milk after someone muttered charms nearby. The mediator sighs, scratching his beard, as if silently regretting his career choice. Yet, every case matters, because in a land where survival hinges on animals and hay, even small damages cut deep. You wander through the crowd, listening to gossip. Some villagers say the laws are too rigid, treating beasts as if they understand rules. Others argue that without clear fines, feuds would spiral into violence. Historians still argue whether these quirky laws reflect genuine belief in animal guilt or simply practical ways to keep peace in close-knit communities. Later, a boy slips beside you, giggling. He tells you that once his uncle claimed a neighbor's goose insulted him by honking too much at night. The assembly laughed. But the man insisted it was harassment. You laugh too, but the boy shrugs. Here, even geese cause trouble. As the sun dips low, the cases wind down. Fines of butter, cheese, and silver are tallied, and animals are led back to their pens, some tethered, others free. Peace, however silly, has been purchased once again. Walking back toward the hearth glow of a farmhouse, you reflect on the oddities you've witnessed. Justice here doesn't always look noble or fierce. It sometimes looks ridiculous, like men debating the legal rights of rams. Yet beneath the humor lies something serious. The attempt to keep order in a harsh land, where even one stray sheep can mean the difference between survival and starvation. The wind whips at your cloak, and you hear the distant bleating of sheep carried across the plain. You can't shake the image of a ram, guilty or not, munching grass while humans argue endlessly about its crimes. The wind howls against the turf walls as you make your way toward a small coastal hamlet. The air smells of salt and dried fish, sharp enough to sting your nose. Winter presses hard here, and survival narrows to the simplest of questions. Do you have food, or don't you? And when hunger gnaws, even small crimes take on enormous weight. You step into a storage shed, dimly lit, its rafters heavy with drying cod and bundles of hay stacked to the roof. A farmer counts carefully, muttering to himself, his lantern swaying. Suddenly, shouts erupt outside. A boy has been caught with fish hidden under his cloak. He is dragged into the snow, the precious food spilling from his arms. The crowd gathers quickly, voices sharp, the mood electric with anger. Mainstream fact: in medieval Iceland, theft of essential goods like hay, fish, or livestock was punished more harshly than acts of violence. Food and fodder meant life or death through the long winters. Historians still argue whether this severity reflects practical necessity or whether it reveals a society that valued survival over abstract ideas of fairness. The boy pleads, insisting his family is starving, that he meant only to take a little. But the law is blunt. Theft of food is a crime against the entire community, not just one farmer. If one person steals, others may follow, and the fragile balance of winter stores collapses. The punishment is swift. He will be fined beyond what his family can pay, and perhaps even whipped before the community. You see the mother's face crumple, her tears steaming in the cold, while neighbors murmur uneasily. No one questions the law, but many pity the boy. Quirky tidbit: sagas mention punishments where thieves were forced to return stolen goods while reciting humiliating verses aloud. Imagine being made to hand back dried fish while chanting about your own dishonesty. Not exactly the heroic poetry Iceland is famous for. You watch as the boy is dragged toward the stocks. The crowd pelts him with snow, not stones, but the jeers sting nonetheless. Someone mutters that hunger excuses nothing. Another says quietly that everyone has stolen in lean times. The contradictions hang heavy in the frosty air. Later, you visit a different homestead, where hay is guarded almost like gold. Farmers pace nervously around their stacks, checking fences, sharpening knives. Hay feeds sheep and cattle, and livestock mean milk, wool, and meat. To steal hay is to steal survival itself. One man tells you grimly that he would forgive a blood feud sooner than the theft of his fodder. You realize how the law bends under necessity. Killing a man might be settled with silver or cattle, but stealing food in winter leaves no room for mercy. The law doesn't simply punish, it protects the fragile fabric of life on this island. By evening, you huddle by a fire in a farmhouse, the smell of fish broth heavy in the air. A woman ladles a bowl into your hands, the warmth spreading through your chest. You taste the salty richness and realize why every flake of cod is guarded like treasure. Without it, the endless dark months would be unbearable. Historians still argue whether these harsh punishments made Iceland stronger or more brittle. Did they prevent chaos? Or did they carve deeper divisions between rich farmers and the poor, who struggled hardest through the frost? As you sip the broth, you sense both truths shimmering in the steam. Outside, the wind rattles the turf walls, and the snow piles higher against the door. The boy's cries from earlier linger in your ears, blending with the howl of the storm. Justice here is not an abstract ideal, it is a matter of survival, drawn as sharply as the line between hunger and fullness, between warmth and freezing silence. The storm eases, leaving the world white and hushed. You walk back toward the gathering place. But today, the crowd isn't here to weigh silver or count cattle. They're here to listen. A circle forms around a sagaman, a poet in a long teal cloak, his beard frosted with age and his voice carrying through the cold air like a steady drum. He begins to recite, and instantly the plain fills with life, not with reality, but with memory, exaggeration, and legend. He tells of feuds where men split skulls with axes, but the blows land larger than life, the insults sharper, the punishments stranger. A thief in his verse doesn't just sit in the stocks, he sprouts donkey ears and brays until the crowd collapses with laughter. A murderer isn't fined in silver but condemned to wrestle trolls in a canyon. The children squeal, wide-eyed, while their parents nod, enjoying the mix of history and farce. Mainstream fact: Iceland's sagas preserved much of the island's legal culture, but they were written centuries later, often blending truth with entertainment. Historians still argue whether these sagas are faithful records of medieval law or carefully crafted stories meant to glorify certain families and amuse their descendants. The saga man gestures broadly, his cloak flaring as he describes a punishment turned into epic theater. A woman accused of slander is forced to sit atop a roof beam, wobbling like a hen, until she recites a poem of apology. The crowd bursts into chuckles and someone whispers that their own neighbor once toppled off a roof beam trying to fix a leak. So maybe the punishment was real after all. Quirky tidbit: some sagas mention men carving mocking images of their rivals, erecting them on poles in public spaces. These Nidstangir insult poles were said to curse their enemies, combining ridicule with sorcery. You can almost see them now, grotesque carvings glaring over snowy valleys, sheep looking unimpressed beneath them. As the sagaman's tale unfolds, you notice how memory shifts punishment from shame to spectacle. The boy whipped for stealing fish becomes a trickster who escapes his captors, swimming like a seal through icy rivers. The outlaw exiled into the wilderness becomes a hero who battles monsters with bare hands. History softens, then sharpens again, until truth and imagination blur like snow swept by wind. The audience is enthralled. Farmers lean on their staffs, their breath steaming as they laugh and groan at the twists. Children press closer to the fire, eyes wide. Even the stern priest listens, lips tight but not immune to the humor. You realize that punishments here live two lives. One is cold, raw, and real. Frostbitten fingers in the stocks, hunger gnawing in exile, tears steaming in the snow. The other is story, softened and shaped, where justice is retold as legend and laughter. Both are true in their way and both are needed, one to enforce, the other to endure. Historians still argue whether saga exaggerations help us understand medieval law or simply distract us with color and drama. But as the sagaman's voice rises, describing a feud that ends with one family paying Vergilden goats painted bright blue, you see the real purpose. Memory survives not because it is accurate, but because it is unforgettable. The story ends and the crowd exhales as though waking from a dream. A boy jumps up, swinging an imaginary sword, while his sister shushes him, pretending to be the wise mediator demanding silver. Adults chuckle, then turn back to their daily worries, but the tale lingers in their minds like embers glowing after fire. You linger too, the snow crunching under your boots as you drift away. The sagaman's words echo in the still air, weaving together truth and myth until you can't untangle them. Maybe you don't need to. In a land of harsh winters and harsher laws, perhaps the only way to make punishments bearable is to turn them into stories that warm the night. The sky clears for once, pale blue stretching wide over the snowy ridges. Word spreads quickly that ships have been sighted off the coast. You make your way down a frozen path to the harbor where villagers gather along the rocky shore, their cloaks snapping in the wind. Long, narrow boats draw closer, their sails furled, oars dipping rhythmically. These aren't the usual fishing craft. These are traders and travelers come from Norway, England, and beyond. You watch as the foreigners disembark, stamping their boots against the cold ground. They look around, eyes wide, clearly trying to make sense of Iceland's stark landscape and even starker customs. Their clothes seem strange here. Brighter dyes, finer wool, and their accents ripple through the crowd like unfamiliar birdsong. Mainstream fact: Iceland's isolation didn't mean it was cut off. Norwegian and English merchants visited regularly carrying timber, grain, and luxury goods in exchange for fish, wool, and falcons. Historians still argue whether foreign visitors respected Iceland's legal customs or simply tolerated them as eccentric oddities while trading. The newcomers soon witness a dispute. A man is dragged toward the stocks for insulting his neighbor's honor. The foreign traders exchange confused glances. One mutters that in his homeland, the punishment would be flogging or worse. Another chuckles, saying he'd rather be locked in wood than whipped raw. The Icelanders overhear and shrug. Why bother breaking a body when breaking pride works just as well? Quirky tidbit: records hint that some English sailors laughed at Icelandic punishments, joking that the islanders were too polite for real cruelty. Yet others were unsettled by outlawry, horrified at the idea of casting someone into the wilderness with no hope of shelter. To them, exile looked worse than death. Later, the foreigners are invited to a feast. They sit uneasily in a smoky hall, sipping sour whey and nibbling dried fish. Conversation turns to law, and an Icelander explains with pride how disputes are settled by weregild, not bloodshed. One visitor raises his brow, muttering that in England, such matters are settled with gallows. The Icelanders laugh, saying gallows are for men who fear endless feuds. Here, silver ends grudges faster than ropes. You watch as the traders lean in, fascinated and bewildered. They listen to tales of trial by ordeal, of fines paid in butter, of sheep tethered as punishment. Some laugh, others shake their heads. One young sailor whispers to his companion that this island feels like a riddle. Harsh yet fair, cold yet strangely communal. The night deepens, and gifts are exchanged. Timber for fish, cloth for wool. But the true trade is in stories. The foreigners return home carrying not just cargo, but tales of peculiar Icelandic justice. Men mocked in stocks, women fined for slander, outlaws surviving among trolls. These tales, told in distant taverns, will paint Iceland as a place both odd and admirable. Historians still argue whether foreign impressions of Icelandic law shaped how Europe saw the island, as a quaint curiosity or as a rugged land clinging fiercely to its own order. Standing here, watching laughter mingle with unease, you suspect both are true. When the ships finally push off again, the villagers watch from the shore. The sails catch the wind, carrying strangers back across the sea. Their voices fade, but their astonishment lingers in the air. You turn inland, the wind cold on your face, carrying with you the echo of their bewildered laughter. The sky hangs low, heavy with gray clouds, as you wander beyond the ancient assembly fields into present-day Iceland. Snow crunches beneath your boots, and in the distance, you glimpse Reykjavik's lights glimmering against the dark sea. Modern houses rise where turf huts once crouched, but the echoes of old punishments cling stubbornly to the land. You pause beside Thingvellir, where the Althing once gathered. Tourists stroll with cameras, unaware that the rocks around them once rang with verdicts of outlawry and whispered bargains of blood money. A guide explains cheerfully that this place is the cradle of Icelandic democracy. You smile faintly, remembering the outlaw trudging alone into the wilderness, his cloak snapping in the wind. Democracy here was always fragile, shaped by necessity as much as ideals. Mainstream fact: Icelanders proudly trace their modern parliament, Althingi, back to the gatherings of 930 CE, though today it sits in Reykjavik rather than in the open air of Thingvellir. Historians still argue whether the continuity is genuine lineage or more of a symbolic claim woven into national identity. You walk on, down quiet streets where murals brighten gray concrete walls. One painting shows runes carved into wood. Another depicts sagas with stylized heroes. Folklore and history breathe just beneath the city's modern hum. A barista serves you coffee, her tattooed wrist flashing with a symbol that echoes an old stave charm. Old fears and old protections find new skin. Quirky tidbit. In parts of rural Iceland, farmers still joke about outlaw caves, hollows in the lava where criminals once hid. Teenagers dare each other to spend a night in them, whispering that the spirits of exiles still pace restlessly inside. The caves may be empty, but the stories keep them alive. You wander farther, into the countryside. Sheep still dot the hillsides, unconcerned by history, their bleats drifting on the wind. Haystacks rise in neat rows, a reminder that survival still hinges on winter stores, though now guarded by tractors instead of knives. The ghosts of old laws watch quietly, invisible, but persistent. At Xochimilco, wait, no, you catch yourself. That was a different dream, a different water-bound world. Iceland's landscape is harsher, sharper. Lakes freeze, lava fields stretch silent, and gulls scream over cliffs. Yet both lands carry their past in the earth, whispering through moss and stone. In a village cafe, a man laughs that his grandfather still used the phrase, "put in the stocks" when scolding children. Another says that calling someone an outlaw still carries a sting, even if today it just means someone missed paying their parking tickets. The language of punishment lingers, softened, but never gone. As dusk falls, you stand again at Thingvellir. The Rift Valley stretches wide, the earth split by ancient tectonic forces, as if even the land itself can't quite agree on its shape. You think of all the judgments once spoken here, banishments, fines, ordeals, humiliations, and how they echo still, woven into the identity of this island. Historians still argue whether medieval punishments in Iceland were cruel or pragmatic, whether they broke people or bound them together. Looking out over the darkening valley, you feel both answers in the silence. Cruelty in the loneliness of exile, pragmatism in the barter of silver for blood. The wind picks up, tugging at your cloak, carrying the scent of snow and salt. You close your eyes, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a raven caws, its harsh voice timeless. And in that sound, you hear it all. The outlaw's footsteps fading into wilderness, the priest's chant over boiling water, the jeers at the stocks, the whispers of charms, the laughter at absurd fines. The past is not gone. It lingers, soft as breath in the cold air. Now the journey softens, like snow falling gently across the plain. The harsh voices fade, the disputes dissolve, and the punishments grow distant. You drift instead into the hush of Iceland's winter night. The land lies still, mountains dark against the sky, rivers glinting faintly under a veil of frost. You imagine yourself lying beside a slow-burning fire in a turf hut, the thick walls muffling the wind. Outside, the world sleeps under its blanket of snow. Inside, you breathe warmth, the scent of wool and wood smoke curling into the quiet. Each breath comes slower, deeper, softer. The memories of outlawry, of stocks and trials, fade into something gentler, less judgment, more story. They become echoes, carried on the wind like sagas whispered across centuries. You let them drift away, one by one, until only calm remains. The firelight flickers, glowing gold against the shadows. You close your eyes, feeling the weight of the blankets, the comfort of stillness. Outside, snowflakes fall endlessly, covering every footprint, every scar, until the land is whole again. The past rests. You rest. Your thoughts slow, like the hush of falling snow. There is no law rock here, no punishment waiting, only peace, only silence, only the steady rhythm of your own breath. The journey is complete, the night stretches long, and you sink into its embrace like a traveler finally home.